himself as a patriot, of course. But his every action seems to have the opposite result to that which he is publicly intending. I mean, the amount of money that the Russian people have lost to him and his cronies is absolutely staggering. What's quite shameful is that most of it, well, not most of it perhaps, but a significant amount of it has been washed through the City of London. 0345 6060 973. Elephant and Castle, Jello.
Yeah, hello there, Nick.
Yes, sir.
You say what the West need to do to stop this madness. I have 2 points. First, the first one is how they're going to stop Putin. The second one is the ramification of Putin winning this war. The first one is what they have to do is to arm first of all is to take the present government out of Kiev and take them on exile. Then arm the Ukrainian to the teeth, long missiles, anything that you can put your hands on apart from nuclear materials, give it to them, and stop sanction Putin to the teeth. Allow any innocent Russian to leave the country, but apart from the normal innocent civilians, every Russian, that whether you're a policeman, you are a member of the government, you are a military man, there's to sanction each and every one of them. You will see people who start to desert the army, the police, because everyone that's with the government, they're all collide. I mean, they're all guilty of what's going on, and isolate the country total isolation. Nothing. Any family member from Russia that work for the government, the kids that lives abroad, send them, all of them back. If they think Putin is it's a nice place, it's a nice country to live, it's nice government to be with, you will see within short period of time, believe me, they will turn around and they will tie Putin and kneel him on the ground. Then the other thing again, if Putin win, if he take over Kiev, he's gonna move on to next country, and my suggestion is the lesser of the two evils, because once he move in, anything could happen. He could move into any country. We're gonna end up in something bigger than what the Western country gonna lose now economically, because should he attack any NATO member country, it's gonna be all-out war, and the same losses that the Western government they're scared of right now. We're gonna lose more than that, and the other thing again, people are seeing the West as weak right now. Countries are rather most countries rather ally themselves with Russia because they know they'll be much safer than being in the hands of the West, because always the West will always betray them. Because look what happened to Kiev today. I mean, to the Ukrainian government today. Believe me, either way, they got. If things continue as it is, they're going to take over the country, and they're not going to be member of NATO, and they will even lose the whatever they had before.
But so does that actually constitute betraying them, though?
Yeah, of course it is, though, because I didn't see any reason for any reason for the NATO or United States or UK to say they're not going to put foot on the ground, because Putin not going to. If believe me, I guarantee you this: if they had a NATO troop in Ukraine, Putin will not use any nuclear bomb. They're going to be a conventional war. Yes, a lot of people will die, but at the end of the day, he will withdraw, because nobody on earth is mad to use a nuclear bomb, because only one you're going to use, only one time, right? That's all you're going to use, and he's only one person. Even if you got thousands of them, you understand? He's not going to launch thousands of missiles all over the world And other. You have how many countries with nuclear deterrent?
Right.
So it's not going to do it. It's a brag.
6 that we know about. Okay, I'm not sure that. I mean, people are talking about the prospect of nuclear war. You have to imagine that's he didn't actually say it, Putin. I mean, that's what we're inferring from what he said, that we're going to suffer consequences that like the likes of which you'd never seen before. That was inferred as meaning that it will be all-out nuclear war. But I mean, that can't possibly be the case. That can't possibly happen. But then if we were thinking about this prospect a month or so ago, we would have probably said that he can't possibly roll tanks into Ukraine. In fact, there was a video going around social media today from a few years ago that has not aged well, and it was Boris Johnson sitting in front of one of these select committees who was saying that the idea of having a tank war in Europe was inconceivable, and that we didn't need to spend money in that regard. What we have spent vast amounts of money on appears to be giant bits of kit, like exciting, glamorous ships and submarines and so on, that we can stick a Union flag on that look great in the background of a prime ministerial selfie. Not the sort of nuts and bolts, the boring stuff that we actually are in want of now. 0345 6060 973 LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. LBC with Nick Abbott.
0345 6060 973. Joe texts, "This is heartbreaking. The Ukraine President Zelensky told EU leaders this might be the last time you see me alive." Livio texts, "For the last 60 years we've been told that we have to have nuclear weapons to guarantee our safety. Now we're being told that we daren't risk a war with Russia because they have nuclear weapons. Surely this is an irrelevance, since if they were to use them against us, then we would retaliate accordingly. Mutually assured destruction is, I believe, what it's called," says Livio. "Therefore, any conflagration we may have with Russia will remain a conventional fight unless Putin is completely unhinged and decides to nuke us anyway." It always did seem a bit of a bizarre justification to have nuclear weapons. I didn't quite get that, because I think it's probably true that if you are the first to launch a nuclear weapon, then almost by definition you'd have to be insane. And if you are insane, then you're not thinking of the consequences of your action. So it wouldn't make any difference whether your opponent had nuclear weapons or not. Unless you can poke a hole in that. 0345 6060 973. Q. Nick.
Morning, Nick.
Hello.
Hello. Yes, those make several points, really. One is it's almost gobsmacking how Biden has allowed Putin to take Ukraine the way he has. As soon as the tanks were piling up at the border, they should have been putting in sanctions then to crash the ruble and crash the Russian stock market, and not after. It seems very hindsight that the EU, Biden and Boris Johnson have reacted like this. Secondly, the second point I'd like to make is that a good point was made by Donald Trump. I know it's not, I wouldn't call him a great man, but I'd say he's quite right in what he said, that he would never have allowed it to get to this point where we are allowing Russian tanks to roll into Ukraine in the first place.
What makes you think that? Because Donald Trump is on record as saying that he doesn't think that Ukraine is a country. He would have been siding, and is siding, with Vladimir Putin.
But on the same token, though, that he was quite good at brinkmanship in Biden. He knows how, and Putin was fully aware of how weak Biden was when Biden evacuated Afghanistan. And what Trump was good at was that he was able to. I think he was able to do fantastic brinkmanship in regards to North Korea. If you look at his record with North Korea, China.
What about his record with North Korea impresses you? What did he achieve?
That he shook hands on the border. I believe he was the first president to cross the border since the Korean War.
But what does that achieve?
I think it achieves an idea that actually the lines are open for conversation. Whereas with Biden, I don't think the lines have been there. I think it was Biden who cancelled the meeting prior to the invasion of Ukraine.
Having a conversation with Kim Jong-un didn't actually achieve a single thing.
But I think it's that fear. It's sort of like that sort of like leveling up.
Okay, what you're describing is that people didn't know what Donald Trump was going to do next, probably because Donald Trump didn't know what Donald Trump was going to do next. He just thought it up and did it on the spot. That's not really something to praise. And the notion that Vladimir Putin would not have had the nerve to take Ukraine if Donald Trump was in power is completely the opposite of the truth, because, as I said, Donald Trump is an admirer of Vladimir Putin and has in the past approved of the takeover of Ukraine by Russia and is sitting in admiration of Vladimir Putin's actions today. So it would have happened quicker, and the sanctions probably would not have been levelled at all. But I do agree with you that they came a bit late. Thanks for that, Nick. 0345 6060 973. Jane says it's a terrible situation that the rest of Europe and the UK could stop if they really wanted to. If we just had strong enough leaders, we could have provided more of a deterrent. I fear this really is the start of a larger war to come, one that we have already seen twice before in Germany. It is interesting that although the various countries of NATO do appear to have become closer and are thinking in consort after the invasion of Ukraine, there has been some reluctance to really impose sanctions as with one voice, because Italy wanted their luxury goods to be excluded from sanctions. They're still keen to sell expensive bags and shoes to rich Russians. The Germans didn't want the oil to stop from Russia. We were very reluctant to inconvenience the banks in the City of London, and everybody wants to say that they're doing the right thing and they're taking tough measures. But it all seems a bit, yes, okay, we'll go along with that, but let's protect ourselves while we're doing it. It's a reluctance to actually suffer the consequences of the strongest possible measures without actually, exchanging gunfire. Ballum, hello, Keith.
Oh, hello, Nick. Thanks for having me on. Fantastic discussion. I could hear the incredulity in your voice, actually, Nick, when you were talking about nuclear weapons. And I'm just wondering whether this reflects, and quite understandably, a wider problem with this whole situation, because we really do have to face up to that reality. I mean, am I right in saying it's the first European war which we start with tens of thousands of nuclear weapons in the background?
Yes.
So it's a unique moment.
There's been, it depends on what you mean by war. I mean, there's been conflagrations, of course, but...
Yeah, but with the main protagonists having that degree of weaponry.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's not a normal war, and we really should think about what the implications of that are. Do you agree with me?
Well, so far it's a normal war. It can get abnormal at any moment, but if we sort of harp on that, then we're going to be rooted to the spot with fear and unable to do anything.
Well, I take that point very, very, very well. But, on the other hand, nor do we want to sleepwalk into a situation. If we're honest with ourselves about what we're facing, and it is a difficult thing to face up to, there's a greater chance, I think, of finding a route that avoids the worst case scenario. And you were asking, what should the UK do? I think what the UK should be doing is trying to get to the bottom of, if by back channels or whatever intelligence services, Putin really wants. Now, look, he's not going to probably tell us what he really wants, because, by definition, he's an extremely clever and sneaky operator, and he will keep his cards as close to his chest as he can. But it would be great if there was somebody in the background, let's just pray that there is, who has some sort of back channel to him. Because what we're all asking ourselves is, where is he going to stop? We think we're looking at the invasion of Ukraine. We're not. We're looking at the invasion of Western Europe. That is the borderline with Western Europe. that's what's at stake. Does Western Europe have any independence anymore? The man who's doing this has 6,000 nuclear weapons. So we have to face up to that fact. What does he really want? Does he want to take over the whole of Western Europe? Or has he got a limited goal? I suspect it's a limited goal. Because however bad he is, I don't think he's mad. There's a lot of talk at the moment about he's deranged. I think that lets him off the hook. He's worse than that. He's horribly rational. That's my personal view.
But it would be irrational. But if that's the case, it would be irrational then to pick a fight with the rest of Europe outside the border of Ukraine, because he's going to bump into NATO, and NATO includes America, and America spends more on its defence than the next highest spending 8 countries put together.
Yes, but he just watched America surrender in Afghanistan, like one of your previous callers just said. That was an atrocious spectacle. It will shame the West forever, what we did in Afghanistan, the way that we came out and we abandoned them. And he said to himself, you know what, the West is dead.
Well, it's interesting, but it's interesting you bring up Afghanistan, because Russia, of course, also left Afghanistan with its tail between its legs in failure.
Well, that's true, but that wasn't Putin's Russia. I mean, what Putin believes he has done for Russia, and I think to some extent the Russian people believe he has done so far. And remember, he's just gone AWOL. Up to this point, you can sort of go along with the rationale of what he's done, or however much you may detest his methods. But I think with this step, he has kind of lost it, I agree, except that there may still be a calculation in what he's done, which is that the West has never been more weak. As I was just saying, he looked at the retreat from Afghanistan, and what he saw us do was just simply abandon Afghanistan to its fate. And what he said is, the West will also abandon Ukraine to its fate. And guess what? That's exactly what we're doing. And I heard someone in the Commons today, a high-up Tory minister, saying, well, no, we can't have a no-fly zone in Ukraine, I'm afraid, because that might bring us into direct conflict with the Russians. I just thought, hang on a minute, that's what we're in. If we can't go into direct conflict with the Russians, then we have just surrendered the whole of Western Europe to Putin.
Well, that seems an extreme position. We may have surrendered Ukraine to Putin, but some people might think that actually that's not any of our business, really. We don't have anything invested in Ukraine, not really. They're not part of NATO.
Nick, we required...
It's not our duty.
Sorry, we required Ukraine to surrender its nuclear weapons in return for guaranteeing its security. Now we're simply saying, sorry, we're not going to guarantee your security. Good luck. Here are a couple of guns. Goodbye.
Right. I'm going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid, Keith, because that music does indicate that I'm right out of time in this hour, but I'll continue this conversation in the next hour. 0345 6060 973 LBC.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nick Abbot.
4 minutes past midnight. I'm Nick Abbot. This is LBC. Now, following the Russian invasion, charities have urged the UK to welcome thousands of potential refugees from Ukraine. Let's talk about that with Sonia Skeets, who is Chief Executive of the organisation Freedom from Torture, which has done a lot of work on supporting torture survivors wwho are refugees. Hello, Sonia.
Hi, Nick. How are you?
Very well, thanks. What are your thoughts then on the government's response so far to the prospect of accepting refugees from Ukraine?
Well, we were really delighted a couple of days ago to hear the Prime Minister tell Parliament that the United Kingdom will be welcoming Ukrainians who are fleeing persecution. We're really keen to see him follow through on that, but bemused because at the very same time his government is pushing through Parliament a law that would criminalise any Ukrainian refugee who finds their way here by themselves to seek protection. So on the one hand, the government's saying all of the right things, but through their actions, they're tying their hands to do exactly what caring people across the country expect of them in the face of a humanitarian crisis like this.
Yes, that does seem to be their way. They say, I'm going to do one thing, and then they do the opposite. It is a government that seems to have defined itself by its antagonism to foreigners in need heading our way.
Yeah, absolutely. And also showing that it has a very kind of hypocritical approach to international law. So on the one hand, we hear the Prime Minister chastising Vladimir Putin for violating sovereignty, war crimes potentially. And on the other hand, trying to pass laws that would drive a coach and horses through the Refugee Convention, which of course was the big treaty that the United Kingdom and many other states came together after the horrors of World War II to agree to ensure that people fleeing wars and persecution, torture, would find protection. So there is this terrible hypocrisy and doublespeak that as a country we need to be calling out. We've seen across many, many policy agendas that when under pressure from the public, this is a government that is prepared to turn around and reconsider foolish things that it was proposing to do. We've got a petition underway at the moment that is approaching 100,000 signatures of people calling on Boris Johnson to do the right thing and to abandon these proposed laws that would criminalise Ukrainians and other asylum seekers who are trying to reach the UK to secure the protection that here in this country we can offer them.
Yes, that may be true, but is it not also true that Boris Johnson owes his position as a Prime Minister of this country to his animosity towards foreigners in either here already or on their way here?
And that's a really interesting question, because if you go back to the last general election and take a look at the Conservative manifesto, they promised to continue the tradition of providing asylum in this country to people who need it. What's happened since then is that there has been a terrible politicisation of survivors of torture and others who are trying to reach the UK through very perilous journeys, because at the same time the government has shut down safe routes for people to secure safety here. So actually I would say that if the Prime Minister was being truthful to what he took as a policy office to the electorate, he would live up to the fine words that he made in Parliament 2 days ago and ensure that people from the Ukraine and other parts of the world needing protection are able to access a fair, efficient and effective asylum system here in Britain.
It's not perhaps unfair to say that being truthful is not his most obvious quality. Is it the case that the government have said, with relation to refugees in general, that you must apply by legal means and then made it virtually impossible for them to do that?
Exactly, and that is, and it's an absolute horrendous situation that the country is waking up to. I mean, just think about the people in Ukraine right now who are trying to flee from Russian aggression. They're doing what you or I would do in that situation. They're picking up their kids, they're running for the borders, and they're not going to stop until they find somewhere where they feel safe. And for most people, that will be in neighbouring states like Poland and Moldova, but some of them with family and other connections here in the UK will try to make their way here, and it's entirely understandable. And, as a country, what we need to do is ensure that provisions in this Borders Bill that would deny access to an asylum system for those people are abandoned, and there's going to be a big vote in the House of Lords on Monday night asking the government to do exactly that.
Do you think that the general public, I mean, you do, you say that you have, 100,000 or so signatures, but just generally, the sense you get from the media, who of course are just telling the public what they want to hear, is that there's a certain demonisation of people who want to come here. I mean, they're always painted as young, fit men who could have stayed and rebuilt their country. They're not women, they're not children, and those that are children are just pretending to be children. They're actually adults, and there's just such negativity. And if the media, if the press are printing it, it's because they know that that's what their readership want to read.
They're also taking a line from government, which has, for purely political ends, decided to weaponise asylum seekers in the hope that it will keep the country fixated on border control and, diverted from many of the policy challenges that the government is failing to deliver on, and deliver them the next general election as the country, caring people across the country need to come together and stand up and say not in our name. And we're so delighted to see that happening. We have, assembled the largest refugee rights coalition in the history of Britain, more than 400 people. We've got tens of thousands of people joining actions to put pressure on parliamentarians to do the right thing on these terrible provisions in the Borders Bill that are coming up for a vote again soon. So, there is a sort of a sense as well that the tide is turning and that the government has gambled and gotten it wrong. This is a caring country. We have shown that time and time again, decade after decade, in the face of these conflicts. And this is another one of those great moments where we can see the country coming together and demanding that our politicians do what's right.
The refrain, both during the EU referendum and now, government ministers are actually saying this now, is that refugees must take shelter in the first safe country. They shouldn't travel through a country to get to somewhere else. And of course, you can't arrive here without going through somewhere else unless you arrive by plane. And so that rather excludes, by that argument, all refugees.
More or less. And in pushing this line and in trying to legislate to enforce it, this government is on a track to violate, in one of the worst ways imaginable, the Refugee Convention, which we were a driving force behind after the Holocaust. This bill has been described by leading lawyers as the greatest assault on refugee rights in British history. And, for any of our listeners who are terribly worried about that, there is something you can do. Please write to your Member of Parliament and tell them to vote against Clause 11. Indeed, any parliamentarian who does vote in favour of that clause is effectively voting to slam the door on Ukrainians and other asylum seekers who desperately need our help. So we've got a little bit of time to act as a country. Freedom from Torture has a petition on our website which people can use in order to get the message through to the parliamentarians, or if they want to write to their MP themselves, please do so. Tell them to vote against Clause 11 in the Nationality and Borders Bill and to show their support for a compassionate refugee protection system here in Britain.
Do you get the sense that there is something of a coordinated campaign to push through a variety of human rights and human rights legislations? There's the Voting Restrictions Act, there's the one about restricting your ability to protest, and the one that you've just described. It doesn't seem as though we're going in the right direction, does it?
No, and it is just so ironic for a Conservative government to be pushing an agenda to reduce opportunities, for ordinary people to hold the state to account. I mean, this is a fundamental principle of conservatism, isn't it? That ordinary people should be able to assert their rights and challenge overreach on the part of the state. And yet we have a government of Conservative complexion that is doing everything it can to put itself above the law. And you say you're absolutely right to be drawing the dots between all of these manoeuvres. There is also the effort to weaken significantly, to tear the heart out of our Human Rights Act. This is a deeply authoritarian turn that we're seeing happening here in Britain, and it's not unfamiliar to the clients of Freedom from Torture, survivors of torture who have, fled here from authoritarian states. They are seeing these warning signs, and they are terribly concerned about the path that Britain might be going on. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? We have a very engaged citizenry that is showing in all kinds of ways that it can come together and to say no. There were some victories on the policing bill. We were very successful last year in stopping the government from passing laws that would have effectively granted impunity to British troops accused of torture in Iraq and Afghanistan. There are these opportunities. There are these, examples of where we've stood in their way and stood up for human rights and stood up for principles of compassion and dignity and respect. And this moment around Ukraine is another one. It's another opportunity for people to come together and to tell the government what they expect of them in a time like this.
And just on Ukraine itself then, I mean, what sense do you get of the impending disaster? Because there's 50 million people in Ukraine, something of that order, and perhaps people in surrounding countries are also going to be fearful and not comfortable staying where they are. What's the scale of the disaster that may unfold, do you think?
Nick, it is really, really difficult to tell at this stage. A number of things I'd say in response to that. First of all, terrible concerns about war crimes happening in Ukraine. There are already reports from the United Nations and other bodies of torture that has been practiced in parts of the eastern parts of the country that have been taken over by separatist, Russian-aligned forces. There is a history of torture on the part of Russian forces in other parts of that part of the world. So people in the region are terribly worried. There is already around 50,000 people who have fled the country, and many more will follow. You've seen the footage of the roads coming out of Kiev and people in their cars desperate to get anywhere they can. So, the majority of people who do manage to flee, we expect will stay in neighbouring states. A very small proportion will try to sort of push onwards across west through Europe, and a very small proportion of them we expect will try to seek safety here in the United Kingdom because they've got family here or friends or for language reasons. And, what we need to be focused on is making sure that Britain is doing what it can to support the neighbouring states of Ukraine through an force and humanitarian package. We need to be making arrangements to help evacuate and resettle some of the Ukrainians in need, and we need to keep our asylum system open for those who will come here under their own steam and want to put forward a claim for protection, which the Prime Minister has said he will honour.
And just finally, if people want to show their support, what sort of organisations can they get in touch with?
There are a range of organisations that are developing up aid offers for services over in Ukraine looking to help people. There are refugee charities, including Freedom from Torture, that are gearing up to provide support. Many of us are also looking to mobilise people to call on the government to ensure that it is doing the right thing to stand with the Ukrainians. We've got a huge petition on our website via change.org that people can sign on to in order to show their solidarity with Ukrainians and to call on our government to do the right thing. There are Ukrainian associations that are coordinating relief efforts. Just get online and plug in the right words to that search engine and do what you can to help. There are so many great organisations that are rallying together to make sure that people in Ukraine and those who are fleeing are going to get what they need.
That's Sonia Skeets, Chief Executive of the organisation Freedom from Torture, which has done a lot of work on supporting torture survivors who are refugees. I'm going to take your calls, texts and tweets after the break. Tell me if you're ready to accept Ukrainian refugees here.
This is LBC with Nick Abbott.
0345 6060 973. Chelmsford. Hello, George.
Hello, fella.
George.
All this talk of we should get soldiers into Ukraine or we should put on a no-fly zone over Ukraine, and then other people arguing that will start a war, rightfully so, between us and Russia. One thing we have to start admitting to now is that, in a funny sort of way, we are already at war with Russia. Whereas sanctions are designed to target and cripple economies, and get aggressors to back down, that is some form of attack. That is a battle there that we are trying to cripple Putin and the Russian Federation, getting them to back down. However, until Putin is taken out of office or he has a sudden change of heart and starts hugging trees and backing out of Ukraine and softening down, this is only going to escalate. We cannot expect all these sanctions and then whatever comes next just to sit there from here on out. It is only ever going to increase. So although we are not in a hot war with Russia, we have now begun a form of battle, a form of attack against that side of the world, and that is only ever going to increase. And the question is, what do we do next? The sanctions aren't happening fast enough. They're dribbling in from our Prime Minister. He's given them far too much time to see what's coming, to get all their money out. And of course, China's going to back them up as well and really soften the blow, seeing as China is soon to be the largest economy. It's one of the largest economies in the world. It can support another nation. Although Russia is large, it will still be able to support it quite well. I don't really have an answer for what we should do next. I'd like to hear other people's opinions. But I think we are heading towards either another Cold War situation or, worst comes to worst, there are small skirmishes between the Russians and NATO troops, which could only spell catastrophe.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. We are already perhaps in a Cold War. I mean, it's difficult to see that because there's a hot war going on at the moment, as you just described. But yeah, it looks like a Cold War's on the way. Thanks, George. 0345 6060 973. Benny tweets, I think we should admit Ukraine to NATO and give Putin 48 hours to withdraw. If France, Germany, the UK and the USA all aimed missiles at Moscow, we would see if Russia armed weapons and strike immediately and eliminate Putin. Does that sentence make sense? I'm not sure. Russia and the generals don't want this. Well, that is undeniable. 0345 6060 973. Luton. Hello, John.
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, I guess one point that a friend of mine who spent time in Russia, he said the people are missing the fact that Putin is really just the mouthpiece, and there's a whole network of ex-KGB and leaders who are planning to get the Soviet Union reinstated, and I think that's one of the dangers of just seeing it as one person. It's not one person, it's more serious than that. That's just one point I'd make. And the other point, which I know you might not like, but there is some truth in it. As bad as the current president of the United States is deemed very weak, I think he is very weak. And I do think, although Trump was awful and very confused in many ways, the very fact that he was so uncertain and unpredictable, when faced with a dictator, the dictators were almost cancelling each other out. So ironically, that's why it didn't happen under Trump's leadership. He wouldn't have dared to attack if Trump was leader.
I completely disagree. Donald Trump has done nothing but support Vladimir Putin in everything that he has said and done. He seems to be on Vladimir Putin's side. He agreed with Vladimir Putin that Ukraine is not a country. He agreed with Vladimir Putin that it should be part of Russia. Absolutely nothing that Donald Trump has ever said or done would have given Vladimir Putin pause for thought. What is this impression that some people have that Donald Trump would have presented some sort of wall that Vladimir Putin would not have been able to get around? I don't get it. It seems to me that every single thing that Donald Trump has ever said and done is that he's in Vladimir Putin's pocket. But thanks, John. 0345 6060 973. Joanne texts, totally agree with what you were saying. In April 1982, Argentina invaded the Falklands. I was working for a large bank at the time. The Bank of England froze Argentinian funds. When I was asked to check any balances held by Argentinian banks, I found all the funds had been taken over a week before the invasion. So obviously the Argentinian banks had prior warning. The Russian funds must be disappearing fast. I think they've gone already. I mean, we gave them a suspiciously long time to put their affairs in order. The various oligarchs had plenty of time to disappear all of their money from where the British authorities could get at them and plant them somewhere where they can't. Probably on one of those dodgy tax haven islands that, in the most part, have a Union Jack fluttering from the top of their government buildings. 0345 6060 973. Watford. Neil.
Yeah.
Neil.
Hi. Hi, Nick. How are you?
Good, thanks.
I got a slightly different view, which is very, very pragmatic, okay? I'm not here to blame any sides, because that's not the way. Putin is a bad guy. Yeah, okay, he is. There's nothing you can do about it. My view is that in the last 20 years, we have spent $4 trillion in fighting the war against terror. China invested the same amount of money for their roads and belts, initiative.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that means they made huge inroads into, for example, the port of Patrias in Greece is owned by the Chinese. They got a port in south of Pakistan, and they got a port in Sri Lanka. They are in very, very close association. It's like a Russian-Chinese nexus.
Well, they have some interests that are aligned, but I'm not sure they are completely that China is completely in agreement with Russia. I mean, they
what I'm saying is when it comes to pushing against the West here, safety in numbers works better. Yeah, right, for example, I'll give you an example. In Africa, China has made huge inroads.
Yes,
they got control of heavy metals. While we were saying, we want democracy in Afghanistan, and we are, like that goody two-shoes, these girls don't get educated in Afghanistan. It hasn't helped us, what I'm saying, that the China always plays the long game. They'll not invade Taiwan. They know it. It's not worth their while. I think Putin has made a strategic error, for he might pay heavily in terms of sanctions, yeah. But I think it's a bit too late in the day. Like you said, the funds have disappeared. And I reckon the funds have disappeared into Chinese banks.
Oh, well, yes, that is quite possible. Yeah.
Yes.
And they do have, it is in their interest to support each other to a certain extent, but I'm not sure that China are completely on Russia's side. But you're absolutely right about the investment that China is making all over the world, particularly in Africa and places like that, to support their infrastructure and so on, by which method they are, I suppose you could say, to some extent, buying the country. 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Email nick@lbc.co.uk. If you're on Twitter, it's @LBC. It's just past 12:30 on LBC. The news headlines with Zora Sullivan.
Nick Abbot on LBC.
I'll return to your calls shortly, but first we've become familiar with the name Chernobyl. It's apparently the site of a spike of radiation since the Russian forces seized the area. Let's talk about this with Dr. Paul Dorfman, who is Associate Fellow of the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex and a Chair of the Nuclear Consulting Group. Dr. Dorfman.
Hello there.
This area, it's been a long time, 1986, since the nuclear disaster. Is it still glowing with radiation?
Let me think this through. If you're talking about the radiation levels that you would normally find around Chernobyl, it's about 10 times greater than the kind of background radiation you'd find in the UK.
And that's ordinarily?
That's ordinarily.
Right.
That's ordinarily. So what we've got here is I can go through the numbers, but that won't help your listeners.
No.
What you've got here is about a 20 times increase in their background. Now, the thing about that is that that's the sort of thing at 60 sieverts per hour. That's what it comes out at. You get up to the doses that would make me twitch relatively quickly. In other words, it's the kind of doses that, internally inhaled would give you cancer in about 10, 15, 20 years' time if you were unlucky enough.
Give us an idea of what the area is like. I mean, are people living there now?
No, it's an exclusion zone.
Right.
It's an exclusion zone that happens after a nuclear catastrophe.
So the exclusion zone is about what sort of distance around the actual plant itself?
I haven't been looking at Chernobyl for a long time now, but I mean, I'm sure your listeners
could... Would it be a mile or 20 miles, something like that?
I honestly don't know, but right. I'm sure your listeners could. I mean, I haven't looked at Chernobyl for some time now, but I'm sure your listeners could Google it and look at it through.
So it's, as far as sort of a habitable area, it completely isn't. There's nothing there really for Vladimir Putin to take over. It's something of a desert. So why would he want to send his troops in there, do you think?
I mean, it's en route to Kiev. It's just part of the invasion. It's just part of the Russian tanks rolling through, and it's paradoxical insofar as, of course, that Rosatom, the Russian nuclear corporation, built, maintained, largely operated the Chernobyl reactor, and now it's back in Russian paws.
So he really doesn't care about his troops at all, does he? He's just sending them in a direct line through an area in which they, just by dint of them being there, they're going to get cancer and die as relatively young men.
Well, no, hang on. It's important to be, let's stick to facts here. Not everyone going to the Chernobyl region is going to get cancer and die. Far from it. But the reality is, of course, is that your risk of cancer would increase without any question. Okay, if you were exposed to these kinds of levels. But it's important to be honest about the risks that people face around this, and not to exaggerate them. The thing, though, of course, is that, quite frankly, nuclear reactors and conflict, they simply don't go well together. And in an increasingly, in a world that's facing increasing conflict, there's always something about nuclear that seems to be, a bit of a problem, really. Mm.
Well, people, will immediately jump to some sinister conclusions that he's actually sent his men in there for some sort of nefarious reasons to spread this poison more widely. I mean, is there anything there that he could use against the Ukrainians or indeed the rest of the world?
No. That's not the case. I mean, it's simply that you've got heavy armor rolling through a contaminated zone and churning up the contamination, and that heavy armor is rolling through because it's en route to other destinations. So it's not kind of a nefarious move on behalf of Putin. It's just. It's just what happens when you get war and nuclear reactors, or even defunct nuclear reactors, mixed up. And that's putting aside, of course, the 15 operating nuclear reactors that exist in Ukraine. And let's hope that there's no missile or there's nothing else that goes amiss here.
Well, okay. Let's then suppose we can take out the idea that he wants to take the area for nefarious reasons. It's just a quick route from A to B. Yeah. What about the possibility of accidentally causing some further disaster? What sort of material is still there, and how is it held?
Well, you've got the world's worst nuclear catastrophe that's held contained beneath a kind of a structure a multi-billion pound structure that took billions upon billions of pounds, dollars, euros to construct over many, many years, that contains a significant amount of high-level radioactivity, and that's just within the reactor station itself. Around the reactor, of course, you've got this exclusion zone, which is essentially relatively heavily contaminated, and parts of it have what's known as hot particles. In other words, they have really nasty little bits of radiation knocking about. So one sincerely hopes that there's no missile that goes astray, either in Chernobyl or in the other 15 nuclear plant that exists in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm going, what I'm getting at is what is the sort of nature of the containment units? Are they built to withstand a tank rumbling over them, for instance?
Well, a tank won't rumble over the containment of Chernobyl. You're talking about this. There's a massive structure that over many years has been for multi-billions has been constructed for only 100 years, by the way, to contain the radiation that is within Chernobyl, because let's face it, it's not being cleared up. It's just being contained at the moment. Okay. Now, a tank won't roll over that. A tank won't roll into that. A tank will roll around it. The problem is, of course, is that if, for any reason, there's a missile or there's a fully loaded plane that charged into it, or whatever, this is a relatively robust structure. That's not amenable to a tank sort of knocking into it. The elevated radiation that you're getting, and it is elevated, it's significantly more than the so-called natural background that you get around Chernobyl, which is much more than the so-called natural background that you get around the UK. In other words, it's potentially cancer-causing. The elevated results that we're getting here is caused by heavy armor rolling around the reactor, rolling around Chernobyl, and stirring up the contamination. That's the result of the initial Chernobyl accident.
Right, so it's just churning up a lot of dust into the air, and that's what people are reading as a raise in the amount of radiation. So
there's one thing about that also. There's a question about how on earth can heavy armor churn up dust in midwinter? And that's the other question, because it's mud, it's not dust, it's not summer. So there are questions about whether it is, in fact, tanks rolling around and churning up dust, or is there something else? And that's as yet unknown.
But what would you speculate about that then? What could actually cause it?
No, I wouldn't want to speculate, but also, in a sense, there's no point in being alarmist around this. There is a problem here. These are elevated doses. I certainly wouldn't want to have to take, or let anybody else have to take, those elevated doses. That's for sure. Okay, but at present, it's not a major catastrophe by any means. But what it does do is that it does highlight what happens when you mix nuclear reactors with conflict and conflict zones. In other words, there's always something odd about nuclear, and this is just one example of it.
Well, I don't wish to become alarmist, but these are alarming times. So can we just do worst case scenarios? If there is somebody in a tank and they press the wrong button and they fire a missile into this facility, and what's inside is then open to the outside, what sort of how would and what distance would it sort of dissipate or disseminate into the outside world? Is it a wind thing, or is it just tell us? Give us an idea.
Okay, but I mean, look, in terms of nuclear risk, it's no good being alarmist about things, and it's no good necessarily trying to exaggerate things. Yes, there is no question about if there was, if there is significant attack if there was ever to be significant attack on the containment of Chernobyl, and if it did pierce layers or levels of protection, it would presumably unveil, significant radiation, and then once again there would be, aerial dispersion. But that's similar to what would happen if someone let off a shot to a spent nuclear fuel pond by any of the 15 nuclear reactors in Ukraine.
Yeah.
I mean, quite literally.
I suppose we can comfort ourselves, can we, with the notion that if it's not really on the cards as a plan, because it's going to affect Russia just as much as it would Ukraine. Is that right?
Clearly, nobody wants to. It's what is it? This is how it's not by a bang but a whimper. It's not. Clearly, nobody wants this to happen, and certainly this is nobody's plan. It's this question of Sod's law. The attendant risk of what if anything actually did, what if this happened, what would be the effect? And unfortunately, the effect would be, catastrophic personally, environmentally, financially, and the rest of it.
Right, well, fingers crossed. Thanks, Paul. Dr. Paul Dorfman from the University of Sussex and the Nuclear Consulting Group. This is LBC.
This is LBC with Nick Abbot. Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850.
0345 6060 973. Let's get to your calls. Streatham. Hello, John.
Hello there, Nick. Hi.
John.
It's very sad what's happening. People are suffering because Russia now knows that the West is weak. And as much as we talk about sanctions, and a lot of the well-meaning people talk about Boris and hasn't been in power for well over a year, at the present situation, Russia knows we're weak. I mean, look, a lot of your callers said the same thing. We cut and ran from Russia. Putin's completely...
From Afghanistan, you mean?
Sorry, from Afghanistan, yeah. Putin's a completely deranged... I mean, I think he might be, psychiatrically deranged. He's absolutely unhinged. And he saw that we just cut and ran from Afghanistan. NATO didn't do anything. The United Nations didn't do anything. I don't know what NATO and the UN are for. They don't help when Afghan women are being butchered and raped by the Taliban. They don't do anything when you've now got Ukrainian young politicians and young soldiers who are going to all be gunned down. I have to say this, Biden is not getting enough criticism. He's the current president of the United States. I was no fan of Trump. He was an awful man. But we've got a president of America now who's very weak, and the prime minister of the UK who's a complete laughingstock. And Putin knows he can do anything and get away with it. And he'll get Ukraine. He's got Crimea. He's got Chechnya. He's bringing Chechen fighters in to Ukraine, which will be a war crime beyond anything imaginable. And who knows how much further he'll expand. And we're not doing. I mean, how much do we pay? I mean, all the Brexiteers kept talking about the money we pay towards the European Union. How much do we pay towards NATO? How much do we pay towards the UN? I don't understand why we're members of these organizations, and it's all very well for well-meaning people to talk about refugees, and we should grant sanctuary. Most of the Ukrainians that I've seen on the TV, and I knew some Ukrainians personally, they don't want to leave. They want to fight, and they'll be killed. They'll be murdered in mass scale. And what's the solution? We just stand and say what? We are now, and sorry to say this, we're not a fighting country anymore, right? Russia knows this. We've been too busy on X, Y, and Z without going into details. We've been having internal debates in this country, and Russia knows that. I mean, Putin's a psychopath. I've worked professionally in the legal profession with psychopaths. He definitely fits the textbook definition of a psychopath, someone with psychiatric disorder almost. And he knows we're weak. He knows that we won't come to Ukraine's aid. And what's next? Will it be Poland next? Will it be Romania next? And what's NATO for?
Well, what is interesting is that there's justification in saying that NATO has been sort of lost its way, but now it is ironic that NATO seems to have been revivified by the very actions of Vladimir Putin against a country because of his supposed fear of NATO. Now it's stronger than ever.
But they're just talking. To me, there's a real difference between talking and acting. The NATO head, whoever he was saying today on the TV that this is terrible what Putin is doing and he must desist. Well, unfortunately, the only people who are standing firm are the Ukrainians who are taking up arms. And I've seen the accounts today of the young men and women who were killed by Russia, who told the Russians to bleep off from the ship, who were just all blown apart. But Sky was talking to one 21-year-old. I found it very moving. He was a lone soldier, stood on the bridge.
But the thing with NATO is that it's an organisation that protects countries in NATO.
But when Ukraine left NATO in ~93 or when Ukraine gave up its nuclear arms in '93 or '94, it was under the direct sort of quid pro quo that America and Britain would back them up, just as, and I draw the parallel, just as we said.
But was that the actual agreement, though? I thought the agreement was that Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal, and the US, Russia, and Britain committed to respect the independence of the country and refrain from the use of force, which is not the same as using force against someone who is using force against it.
But despite the sort of actual legal wording, the point is, in a lot of conflicts, you've got one side that is completely morally doesn't have a leg to stand on, and with Putin's actions, he's one man. I mean, I still don't know how he's managed to exist for so long without someone from his inner circle taking him out. But he's one man.
Money, I would assist. Money and fear.
It's a gangster state that he runs, and he now knows if he is able to take over Kiev and take over Ukraine, he now knows that in 2-3 years, and these people, Putin, Trump, they don't seem to die. So in 3 or 4 years, he'll encroach onto another bit of territory, and we in this country, we're just completely weak. He knows that we can't fight.
Okay.
We've lost in Afghanistan, we lost in Iraq, we've lost in every war in the past 20 years. We're weak.
Okay. All right, we've been over that territory, but thanks for that, John. 0345 6060 973. Hillingdon. Connor.
Hello. Yes.
Wow, very loud. Yes, Connor.
Hi there. What I was going to say was that this has been happening since the Georgia War in 2008, and it's going to continue. This isn't Ukraine is not Russia's endgame. There's actually a book called The Foundations of Geopolitics, which was from 1997, and it's essentially it's like a playbook for Russia under Putin's leadership. And part of the goals that are stated in this book is that Ukraine should be completely annexed and absorbed into Russia. The same for Finland and a number of Baltic states, including NATO members like Poland, should be given special statuses to essentially form part of like a new Russian empire. Essentially, is what that book is aiming for. And interestingly, this book also states an aim to cut the UK off from Europe. But there was a quote I heard earlier on LBC, and it's where they didn't, they believe NATO is going to be dragged into this regardless, and effectively we should be supporting Ukraine more now to essentially head this off in the future. the sanctions at the moment, I feel that they don't go far enough. Russia's been sanctioned for years, albeit not this strong, but they've been getting sanctioned since the Salisbury poisonings, since the Georgia war, all sorts of events.
They were very light touch sanctions, though, weren't they? But I think specifically because too many people in this country would have lost their access to too much money if we came down really hard on Russia. And I think that informs the reluctance of people in this country and elsewhere as well to really come down hard on Russia, because it would affect us too.
Yeah, exactly. It's again, I heard this earlier on LBC. It's like trying to take Russian money out of London. It's like trying to take the eggs out of a baked cake. It's exactly true.
That's an interesting way of putting it. Connor, I'm going to have to leave it there. Sadly, that's the end of this programme, but the conversation will continue on LBC. I'll be back at 10 tonight. Ian Payne is here from 4 o'clock. But first, it's Clive Ball.
Nick, thank you. Yes, we'll be bringing you the latest developments from Ukraine, where troops are closing in on the capital, Kiev. The Ukraine president says that Russia will try to storm Kiev tonight, so we'll bring you the latest on that as it comes in. We'll also be looking at the strategy behind all of this, talking to military experts. We'll find out whether there is the possibility of some kind of diplomatic solution. Have sanctions gone far enough? Most important of all, your opinion on all of this. 0345 6060 973 73 73 73 73 73 73 73 73 73 73 73 73 73 7